Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we cover the latest developments throughout the eastern part of the front line and a statement by the Ukrainian defense minister about a gathering of Russian troops in the north for a new offensive. Starting out in the east, here to the south of Netailova, the Russians have expanded their control in the south of the village. This has led to them capturing the fortifications southeast of Netailova and launching attacks to match the front line with the river line that goes through here at the center. The objective of the Russians here is to secure the southern flank of Netailova and start launching offensive operations towards the Ukrainian fortifications west of Nevelsky. The Russians are now able to launch attacks to capture the final fortifications east of Nevelsky. Following that, it is likely that the Russians will launch attacks towards Nevelsky from the southeast and from the north to combine and attack from all directions towards the capture of the village and pushing down southwards towards the north of Krasnoarivka and west of Netailova towards Karelivka. The Russians here would be looking to gain control over Nevelsky, which is the final village in the area, which would limit the Ukrainian positions and fortified positions west of Donetsk and allow the Russians to create a buffer zone between that of the city of Donetsk and the next Ukrainian line east of Selidove. Following this, the next Russian target would be in the direction of Selidove, as such fighting will take place by the village chain here west of Donetsk, as well as in the north by Yastrodivka and west of Avdiivka. Further north here in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Russians have expanded slightly to the north of Kalinia, where the Russians have managed to gain control over further fortified positions of the Ukrainians. The final parts are within Ukrainian control here next to the forest patch, and the final parts of the fortified positions near Kalinia is in the gray zone. This shows that the Russians now are able to push through Kalinia without worrying about the Ukrainian fortifications to the north and are likely to progress with further offensive operations north of this to gain control over the final fortified positions. This will allow the Russians to start attacks in the direction of Rivorivka. The Ukrainian positions here are located on the high grounds compared to the eastern positions by Dubova-Vasilivka and likely the Oriovo-Vasilivka direction as well. The Russians are in an uphill battle. This makes it difficult for the Russians to push onwards in the northern directions, which is why they are currently limiting themselves along the eastern microdistrict of Chasiv Yar and Kalinia, after which they can advance from a southern direction, which will be from a leveled ground and give them a better advantage. At the same time, they're pushing towards the canal where they are looking to cross over. If the Russians gain control over Chasiv Yar, they would overlook the entirety of this area by having the high ground positions that oversees all of it, all the way from Bakhmut to the east and Konstantinivka to the southwest, to the north by Oriovo-Vasilivka and even further, are all located on a lower ground than Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar is the peak of all of these positions. Moving further north here in the direction of the Serebets river line, on the western bank of it, the Russians have expanded further west of Novovodiane. Following Russian assaults here further north, the Russians are expanded along the positions by the forest patches where positional fighting is taking place. The Russians are here looking to expand to gain control over the forest patches before moving further west in the direction of the Ukrainian positions further westwards, like Rekivka to the south and the village chain here to the west. This is an attempt by the Russians to gain control over Ukrainian fortified positions here near Novovodiane and to secure the footholds the Russians have across the Serebets river line. The Ukrainians have the southern parts and northern parts of the Serebets river line as fortified positions, while in the direction here west of Novovodiane and Svetove in general, this part here is an area where the Russians have as a foothold across the river line. The more they expand this, the more they're able to concentrate their forces and push in a western direction. This will allow the Russians to develop an offensive operations here in the Luhansk-Oska river direction. Moving further north to the Kharkiv offensive, the Ukrainians continue to gather further troops here in the northern direction, where they are also concentrating more to launch counterattacks, which are happening at a regular basis. The Ukrainians are trying to recapture some of these positions from the Russians, where they have succeeded in the direction of Selene and here by Lipsy. However, they have not succeeded in recapturing positions by Vovchansk yet, as the Russians are able to hold on and heavily bombard the Ukrainian positions, where there is constant footage of heavy bombardment of all of these areas here in the north. Now, this brings us to this article here by Reuters, where the media agency interviewed the Ukrainian Minister of Defense. In this article and interview, they talk about the F-16s, Western aid, Ukraine mobilization, and the upcoming Russian offensive. On my channel, we have covered most of these things. Pretty much to summarize it, Ukraine is going to receive F-16s very soon. Ukrainians are trying to mobilize much of their population to increase the strength and size of their army to hold out against the upcoming Russian offensive. The Western aid is arriving, but too little, too late. Now, what is interesting is the statement of Umarov, who is the Ukrainian defense minister. He says about the Russian army. He says the Russian army has about 500,000 troops within Ukraine and near its borders, and was preparing to add another 200 to 300,000 soldiers. He expects that the Ukrainian army will have a difficult time in the coming months. Therefore, the objective is simply to defend, as the Russians will likely open a new front in the north. Such an operation would be catastrophic for the Ukrainians. Such an operation would likely span from the northernmost border by Belarus, or even include Belarus entirely, all the way down south to the Kharkiv direction. 300,000 soldiers is a significant amount to be spread across the northern section. To put it into perspective, the Russian offensive here in the north includes a maximum of 14,000 soldiers here in the northeast of Kharkiv. The Russian soldiers from the east by Kupiansk and all the way down south to Zaporizhia and further towards Kherson has approximately 500,000 soldiers. This means that the entirety of the front line in the north being open would expand the front line to double its size and approximately 60% more soldiers. If that is spread across evenly, the concentration of troops may be smaller, but that is only if we count the entire area. It is more likely that the Russians will instead concentrate their troops in specific directions, whether that be in the direction of Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv, or either of these cities, we do not know, but the army size of between 200 to 300,000 troops would be enough to take one or two of these cities before moving onwards. Even in the direction against Poltava could be a possibility where the Russians simply attack as a feint in the direction of Sumy and Kharkiv before making their main push in the direction of Poltava. My Russian offensive analysis, where I made a series covering multiple different possibilities and scenarios for a Russian offensive, of which most would be impossible with the mere concentration of 50,000 soldiers which had been reported until this moment, but with a concentration of 200 to 300,000 soldiers, it is suddenly possible. The Russians may be starting an offensive operation this summer that could end the Ukraine war by pushing towards Kharkiv, Poltava, Sumy, and the Dnieper River. With concentration as large as 200 to 300,000 soldiers, such an operation would be possible and even more likely to actually happen, considering that the Ukrainians are struggling with just this small offensive in the north, which included about 14,000 soldiers. How would they deal with 200 to 300,000 soldiers across a much wider front? At the very least, such an escalation would significantly change the nature of the war in Ukraine to a position where the Ukrainians and the Russians will be fighting a hot war rather than the current battle of attrition with little movement. Russians have figured out that with the lack of Ukrainian air defense and the majority of the Ukrainian electric industry being damaged or destroyed, the Ukrainians do not have much time to rely on to buy more time and to build bigger army, mobilize more soldiers, receive more aid. There's not much of a future for the Ukrainian army and country with all of these conditions. And the Russians are trying to take advantage of that with their superior capabilities to mobilize and arm a larger army, due to them outproducing the Western aid with about 3 to 1 times the amount of artillery, for example, and the Russians having thousands of tanks compared to the Ukrainians only receiving hundreds from the West, which makes it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to actually fight on an equal footing with the Russians, much less with the Russian air force and missile force giving them a significant advantage. And with that, we say that this will be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.